Hi everyone, and welcome to the final week of the NIH Online Brain Intensive. So thanks very much to Sarah and the other organizers for inviting me to speak to you all about generative modeling. So this is a bit of a departure from what you've been talking about for the past few weeks, but I promise you that by the end, I'm going to tie it back to fMRI. I'm going to frame today's lecture using perception and perceptual decision-making as the example topics because that's my field. But of course, you don't have to only model perception in the ways we're going to discuss. You could model lots of other things, from neural patterns of activity all the way up through higher order cognition and decision-making, or even emotions. So I want to just preface this by saying that although I'm going to be talking about perception and uncertainty in perception, that's really just to help give us an anchor for the exercises we're going to do. It's up to you to figure out how to apply these techniques to your own particular area of interest or expertise. So, perception. You are an observer, and you're trying to understand the world around you. As a biological organism or an artificial system, like a self-driving car, you are constantly making inferences about the most likely cause of the sensory signals you're receiving. This has been called unconscious inference for a century and a half by psychologists studying perception, but again, this is not just relevant for perception. This kind of process is important for any system that must take in noisy or incomplete information and make an inference about what it means based on limited processing resources. But what this tells us is that a system that is good at this process will actually have two outputs of the inference process itself. First, what is the most likely cause of our sensory information? But second, once I've reached a decision about this answer, what this is most likely to mean, was that a good inference? How sure am I that I made the right choice? And any system that makes inferences based on noisy, incomplete information probably should have a mechanism in place to evaluate both of these things. So that's what we're going to use as our examples today. So the next question is, why should we want to build a generative model and not just a descriptive model for this process? Well, to figure out how exactly this process works, what computations are involved, what neural substrates underlie the process, we're basically going to need to reverse engineer it. And that's what generative modeling tries to do. So we start by building a model that takes in noisy, incomplete information just as an observer would, and it does some computations or transformations on it. It uses that information somehow. And then ultimately it produces outputs, neural activity, behavior, decisions, actions, and so on. And our next step in building a generative model, or in testing the model that we've built, is to push on the model. So you'll change the input somehow, you change the calculation that it's doing in some predictable way, and you see if that model still produces the right output in the behavior or the neural activity. And if the outputs from this model match the outputs of the system that you're trying to reverse engineer, then you can say that you've probably done a pretty good job at describing how the system is producing those outputs, how it's using the information that it has access to. So now we have a model that can be used to predict how the system is using information in order to produce perceptual decisions and other outputs like uncertainty computations that go along with those decisions. So let's use a very simple example in perception. Here's some noisy, impoverished information. These are simplified stimuli, and the dots on the right here are simply the dots on the left, rotated around 180 degrees. So without any additional information, there should be no meaningful difference in how you perceive the dots on the left versus the dots on the right. But there is, of course. The ones on the left seem convex, and the ones on the right seem concave. Why? They're just 2D dots. They're the same dots flipped upside down from one side to the other. So the information coming into the eye, and therefore in the brain, at this exact moment, is basically symmetrical in terms of informativeness between the left dots versus the right dots. But in the world, we also know that light comes from above. And so if you add that knowledge into the equation, all of a sudden you're able to explain why people see these as convex, and these as concave. And you can test whether this influence of the light from above prior on perception is causing the convex versus concave percepts by training people to think that the light may come from a slightly different direction, not straight from above. So take a look at this paper if you want to know the details of how the authors did this training. But it turns out that if you do this training and you change people's perceptions of where the light comes from, their expectations of where the light comes from, then you're going to change their perceptions of whether dots are convex or concave just because you changed where they think the light comes from. And this behavior is beautifully captured by a Bayesian model where the prior expectation of the source of the light gets changed by experience as well, so that when it gets combined with the likelihood, the incoming sensory information, it will change the posterior estimate of whether this is convex or concave. So if we've modeled like this all the steps that happened from intake of noisy sensory information through perceptual output, and we've been able to push around on one of those steps. So if we change the prior expectations, and all of this still is able to describe the behavior that the human participants produce, then we can say we've probably done a good job at describing how the system is using this information. We can see this type of calculation in other visual and multisensory illusions too, like the ventriloquist illusion, where the perceived spatial location of a sound gets pulled towards where you see the simultaneous visual stimulus happening. So that's like when you see a ventriloquist and it seems like his voice is actually coming from the puppet's mouth. You also see this with visual haptic and visual motor integration. So these are all examples where a simple Bayesian generative model can adequately and accurately describe behavior. Here's another example, also in perception, but this time we're going to add the evaluation of uncertainty into the mix. So that's the second half of the computation that I introduced earlier. So once you've decided what it is, you should also have a sense of whether your inference about the stimulus's identity is correct. So in this example, I'll show you two very brief stimuli. They're made up of Gabor patches, so they look like little gray and white stripy things on the screen. And you have to guess whether they are tilted left or right from vertical. Make a guess for each, and then decide which of your two decisions you feel more confident in. So there's two of them, left or right, and then which decision you feel more confident in. Ready? Here we go. Did you see them? Let's try again. Okay, so you decided left or right for both. Now which decision do you feel more confident in? Well, if you run this as an actual experiment, an actual experimental setup, you can titrate the contrast of the two stimuli that I just showed you so that people are equally good at telling left from right for both. So the first one that I showed you is lower contrast, but it's 45 degrees tilted left or right from vertical. And the second one that I showed you is only 5 degrees tilted left or right from vertical, but it's higher contrast. Take a look again. Which one do you feel more confident in? Maybe the higher contrast one, right? So it turns out that when you run this experiment and you titrate it so that people have the exact same probability of being correct in both cases, people will say that they are more confident about their decisions in the higher contrast condition, even though the contrast is completely irrelevant to the left-right decision, because in both cases people are equally good at the task. Why? Well, we built a generative Bayesian model to see why people might be doing this. The model now produces two behavioral outputs, the decision, left or right tilt, for each of the intervals, and also then which interval feels more confident. And we can specify the rules that the observer is using to make both the type 1 or objective decisions and the type 2 or confidence judgments. Although the results aren't published yet, I'll tell you that the answer has to do with the system using some sort of heuristic, a non-optimal strategy to rate uncertainty or confidence. That if you use the optimal strategy, that it doesn't work in describing participants' behavior. So this heuristic strategy relies on the detectability of the stimulus, even if the detectability of the stimulus has nothing to do with how good you are at discriminating it as left from right. So we can use these models to actually study not only how a system deals with noise, but how the decisional process itself leads to certain observed behavior or data. So that's enough examples of some simple things in perception that you might want to model using generative modeling. But of course you're asking now, how do we actually build these things? How do we code these things? Well, we can diagram them, and we can say that the observed or noisy information, X, is a noisy representation of the true environmental variable or variables S. So you as the observer don't have access to S. You can't see S. You can only have access to X, your noisy sensory information, or samples. Then there is some process, of course, that your system uses to go from the samples that you have, those noisy sensory samples, back to this source. So it's going to infer what the most likely cause of your sensory experiences are. So these are the pieces that we're going to need to model. You define the source, or the signal. You define how the samples relate to that source, so what kind of noise is involved. And then you also define the rules that you think the system is using to make that inference, to arrive at the decision, and then also potentially to evaluate the uncertainty in this process. So we want to know how to build one of these models in an actual simulation. What this amounts to in the simulations we'll use is first trying to explicitly specify the types of noise and where they occur in the processing hierarchy. I'm going to introduce a couple options here to get us started. The most obvious one is noise, the kind of thing that we've just been talking about. And the most obvious version of this is type 1 noise. So this is noise that relates to the objective decision. It makes you not perfect at extracting the information from the environment. So the objective decision here would be the left-right tilt in that example that I gave previously. This noise could have a number of sources that you can explicitly specify if you want. So you could explicitly specify that there's external noise in the stimulus, that the stimulus itself is noisy. You could also specify that there is internal noise in the system, and that internal noise could be multiplicative or additive. So multiplicative noise means that as the signal increases in intensity, that the noise also increases. So this is the kind of thing that might lead to a constant or near constant Fano factor in neural firing rates. Additive noise could also be something like baseline firing rates or other sources of noise in the system that have nothing to do with the actual signal that's coming in. There are other types of noise that you can also specify if they were important to the process that you are trying to model. Another type of noise is what we'll call type 2 noise, which is noise at a later processing stage, after that objective decision about left versus right tilt has been made, but before the observer needs to judge uncertainty or confidence. I'm introducing this now because we're going to use it in the first simulation that we'll run. And then, of course, the other big piece of the puzzle is that you need to specify what kind of decisional processes the organism or observer is using to make that inference about the identity or source of the signals that it's getting. So a simple version of a decisional rule is just setting a criterion or threshold, such that anything on one side of a criterion gets categorized one way, and anything on the other side of the criterion gets categorized a different way. That's typically what's used in signal detection theory. But there are other rules or processes that you could use, like Bayesian inference processes, or even multiple stages of Bayesian inference processes, like hierarchical inference. You could also use heuristics that aren't quite Bayesian and are certainly not optimal, and so on. So basically, you have to specify both of these pieces in order to build your generative model. So for our first example of actual code, I'm going to start by using signal detection theory to demonstrate how this works. And then we're going to actually go play with a little toy simulation of this system. So this example uses type 1 noise. It introduces the possibility of type 2 noise as well, which we will get to in the simulation, and it uses a criterion as its decisional rule. Some of you may be very familiar with signal detection theory, but for those of you who aren't, I'm going to go through a quick little intro here. So let's assume you have two possible identities for a stimulus. These could be like left tilt and right tilt in the sample that we saw earlier. So we can assume that the type 1 sensory noise that you get on a single trial is a noisy draw from the probability distribution like this and like this, centered at the true mean of the environmental variable. So here in our true environmental stimulus, you have 45 degrees left and 45 degrees right of vertical. So we're going to center these two distributions at minus and plus 45 degrees. Our simple model makes the assumption, again, that this noise is Gaussian, or normally distributed around that true mean in the environment. So on every trial, you get a single noisy sample, trial 1, trial 2, trial 3, and so on, that's drawn from this probability distribution. So these are 3 trials, 3 samples of a left-tilted stimulus. So we'll next place a criterion here and say that if the sample falls on the right side, you decide right tilt, and on the left side, you decide left tilt. And sometimes you're wrong, and when it actually was right tilted, you say left, and when it was actually left tilted, you say right, and vice versa. So for example, this sample is correct, this sample is correctly identified as left, but this sample is incorrectly classified as right, even though it actually came from the left-tilted distribution. Then, just as with any classifier, including machine learning, SVMs, logistic regression, so on, the distance of these samples, or these internal decision variables from your decision criterion, so this is the absolute magnitude of this distance here, is representative of the probability that that decision is correct, and therefore how confident you should be. So if the observer is supposed to rate high or low confidence in a binary fashion, like you would give in a behavioral task to a person, we can place additional type 2 criteria and assign confidence as a function of where the decision variable is on each trial. So samples that fall in this region and likewise in this region would be rated as high confidence, and samples that fall in the intermediate regions would be rated as low confidence. So here we now have a correct high confidence trial, a correct low confidence trial, and an incorrect high confidence trial. So now that we have our little generative world set up, the beauty of even this simple generative model is that you can push it around to try to match the system that you are trying to model, to not only match that observed behavior, and then also to predict new behavior. So we talked about this earlier, but what this means in the sense of the nuts and bolts of the actual generative model is that you can make the noise different. So let's say that you think that some manipulation that you're doing, or just the noise in the system itself, is bigger or smaller. Let's make it bigger. This will change the percentage of time that you are incorrect. It will also change the percentage of time that you say low and high confidence and so on. You could also move the decision criterion according to an a priori assumption, so a reward rate or a cost function, which is also kind of thought of as adding priors in a Bayesian framework. So let's say that we know that the probability of a right tilt is much higher than the probability of a left tilt, so we're going to move this criterion from its previous location in the center such that we're now much more likely to say right tilt than left. You could also add other sources of noise at the type 2 level. So for example, if I use transcranial magnetic stimulation to zap you in your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, I might mess up your ability to rate confidence or do other metacognitive tasks. So this might make this type 2 criterion for where you say low versus high confidence unstable so that it changes on a trial-by-trial basis. So this would make your confidence ratings less diagnostic of your probability of being correct, and your metacognitive sensitivity would therefore go down. So again, the idea here is if you match an observer's behavior, then you can say you found evidence that this might be how the observer is actually doing this. And this is especially true if your model actually does this much better than any other model that's out there. So there's a really great paper that just came out on model comparison and how we really should be saying not only does this model describe behavior, but it describes it better than all of these other models. Therefore, it's more likely to be correct. And of course, you want this to happen not only for observed behavior, but to predict new behavior as well. And then you can predict that behavior, test it with an empirical experiment to see if your prediction is right. Okay, So now, how do we actually do this with code? Well, rather than go through what we should be doing with PowerPoint, I thought it would be better for us to actually take a look at some code together. So I've provided a very simple simulation to get you started. This is simulation 1 in the Jupyter Notebook. It's a simple signal detection theoretic simulation with both type 1 and type 2 noise. So take as long as you want to play around with that, and then come back here for the next part of the lecture. So that's a simple signal detection theoretic generative model. What about other types of models? As you can probably imagine, there are essentially unlimited types of these computational models, depending on what you're trying to model, perception, cognition, some other simulation or system entirely, and also depending on what knowledge you have about how the system might actually be producing outputs. So for example, we talked about Bayesian models earlier, which combine cues or combine incoming information with prior expectations. There are also evidence accumulation models, a completely different class of models, which add up evidence that you accumulate over time in favor of one or the other stimulus identity alternative. And the idea here with these drift diffusion, these serial probability ratio test, or also race models, is that you make a decision once the accumulated evidence favoring a particular identity reaches a certain threshold, and then you make your decision accordingly. These models are great because they give you more aspects of behavior to model, like reaction time, but they also allow you to think about, okay, maybe this is what neurons are actually doing. So we know that there are neurons in LIP, in FEF, in subcortical structures like the superior colliculus that add up evidence over time and then lead to an eye movement, which is how a monkey reports his decision. So these types of models will allow you to make predictions about neural firing rates and which neurons might be involved in the choice process itself. So take a look at some of these papers if you want to know more about those types of models. There are also some models based on optimal control theory, such as Kalman filters. And these are similar in some ways in that they take into account both prior information and make predictions about what's going to happen in the future, like a probability ratio test, serial probability ratio test. But the idea here is that the Kalman filter is making a prediction at every time point about what is most likely to happen at the next time point. And then it will receive incoming information at the next time point, integrate that error in its prediction into the calculation, and then proceed accordingly. So these types of Kalman filters, these types of models like Kalman filters are often used in modeling sensory motor integration or motor movements like reaching and grasping tasks because they can capture the motor kinematics pretty well, and then we can use them to build artificial systems like robots that can do some of these motor movements just like we do. So we don't have time to go into all of these, of course. The idea here is just to give you a little bit of a taste of what's out there so that you can go and do some of your own research if you're interested. Okay, so that's all very well and good, you might be saying, but this is primarily an fMRI course, so what does this have to do with fMRI? So there's actually a lot that you can do once you have a generative model. So for example, you can see what areas are sensitive to certain aspects of your model, like the criterion or the noise in your system. So once you fit the criterion or you fit the noise in different conditions, you can see what areas of the brain might behave differently according to the fitted parameters. You can also do this with all sorts of other aspects of your model, like the type 2 noise being separate from the type 1 noise, or a shift in a decisional strategy. And you can see which neuroanatomical loci vary with individually fitted parameters across individuals or conditions. Or you can go a different route and use these types of generative models to actually model neurons themselves. Of course, there are lots of ways to model the neurons and their networks. And it would take semesters or years to cover all of that in depth and to do it justice. So rather than do that, I'm just going to list some and then we're going to pick one to focus on for the last little bit of this lecture. So you can have rate averaged models, you can have leaky competing integration, you can have recurrent neural networks. So Xiaojing Wang has done a lot of really beautiful work on these recurrent neural networks, and they can describe things like working memory and so on. You could also build a slightly more involved neural network that does integrate and fire. So you can build oscillations this way. And these types of models will have explicit specification of things like synaptic decay constants or action potential thresholds that may change as a result of plasticity mechanisms, for example. You could also model deep convolutional neural nets or deep learning neural networks. And then you can look at which areas of the brain map onto which layers of the DCNN. So this is kind of the type of thing that some folks, the deep learning is what folks at Google DeepMind are doing and lots of other places as well, IBM and so on. And then you can actually use those and compare them to your fMRI results as well. You could also have all the way down to modeling ion channels or different receptor types or dendritic structure and so on. So there's a lot of different ways that you can model these neurons with lots of different level of detail, and it really depends on what type of system and what level of detail you are trying to model. So regardless of how you choose to model your neurons and hook them up to each other, however, the cool thing here is that once you've got neurons, you can model voxels. So you can group the neurons together in ways that you think may reflect their neuroanatomical architecture or organization, and then make predictions about univariate bold results and even classification results as well. So we're going to choose a simple rate-averaged model of neurons for our example today, so this first one that I talked about. A rate-averaged model is pretty straightforward. You just specify, on average, the firing rate of a given neuron in response to a given stimulus. And here's a very simple way to do it. So here we've got some neurons. They have orientation tuning preferences. So that if we show them a stimulus, like this, so this is a right-tilted line, and we've got orientation preferences that vary from horizontal to vertical and everything in between. So we show it this stimulus, we add some noise to this stimulus, and then we assume that the firing rate of these particular neurons is probably some sinusoidal or circular Gaussian function, or similar, of the incoming stimulus, here this oriented line, and their tuning preferences. So we can say that a priori you're going to expect, given this stimulus, that this guy is going to fire the most, this guy is probably going to fire the least. So we would expect firing rates that would look something like this. And this is just based on straight neural firing rates. We haven't hooked up any lateral inhibition or mutual excitation, which you could do. You could also specify units that have combinations of orientation and other factors like spatial frequency tuning preferences. And then once we've made these neurons, we hook them together in ways that make sense physiologically. So like I said, we can get lateral inhibition, you can get divisive normalization, you can get recurrent excitation between units that have similar tuning preferences, and so on. You could then build voxels by grouping these neurons together in anatomically reasonable ways. Then you can train an SVM, a logistic regression classifier, to pick out which voxels are particularly relevant for classifying an orientation versus a spatial frequency, for example. And if you've done everything right, your classifier should pick up on voxels that have the features that you care about and not the features that you don't care about in trying to classify orientation versus spatial frequency for some presented stimulus. And then you can go look for similar patterns in your real brain data. And then once they match, then you can push this model around and make predictions about what might happen in your actual brain data. So we won't have time to go all the way to classification today, but I'm going to get you started with a toy version of one of these basic neural networks, with just a simple rate average model of orientation, spatial frequency tuning, and early visual cortex. Okay, but before you go play with that simulation, I'm just going to give you some final thoughts, and then you can go play for as long as you like. So, as I hope you can see, generative models can be really powerful. They allow us to not only examine behavior or neural activity patterns, but they do so in a way that helps us reverse engineer the system that we're interested in. We want to know what the system is actually doing to produce the outputs that we can observe experimentally. And the best way to test a model once you've built it is to push it around, to turn the knobs that you think control fundamental aspects of the system that you're trying to understand. And then if you do that, the behavior or other empirical data that you observe should match the model's predictions. Now you've built this system that you can push on in lots of different ways and make new predictions about how the brain will react or what experiments would be informative to dissociate between one theory versus another. So if all of this is true here, then you've got a good chance that you've captured something very real about the system that you're trying to model. Okay, so in sum, there are lots of different ways to build these models, but the right one for you depends on what level of analysis or levels of analysis you care about and what questions you want to answer about your own experimental data. But one final thing to remember as you move forward. These models are simple by design, because even if you build a super complex model, you probably won't get everything right. But that's okay. Just because all models are wrong, and they are all wrong, some of them are useful. Some of them are more wrong or less wrong than other models. So the key is to find a model that is less wrong than any other model that has been tried before. And then your model, your new model, can help us decide how to move forward in designing new experiments or new analyses to differentiate among different theories that we're interested in. So that's really all of it for this overview. For the neural network model, as before, I've gotten you started with a very simple little toy simulation. Where you take this simulation after you get to the end is up to you. So thanks very much for watching, and have fun, and feel free to let me know if you have any questions.